Hello, this is Patrice, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the July 28th issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. How the Houthis cornered Saudi Arabia into a new conflict. The Iranian-backed Houthi militia in Yemen has seized on a vulnerable moment for neighboring Saudi Arabia. The group hopes to force political concessions in Yemen. By Vivian Niraim and Shaub al-Mosawa. After 4 years of political deadlock in Yemen, the Houthis were growing increasingly frustrated. A truce between the Iranian-backed militia and neighboring Saudi Arabia had turned into a brittle stalemate, and the Houthis, feeling they had little to lose, wanted greater authority over Yemen and its oil resources. Saudi officials, for their part, had no interest in another clash with the Houthis. Their previous bombing campaign in Yemen had turned into a decade-long quagmire that contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Yemenis from violence, hunger, and disease. They wanted to avoid another explosive conflict that could endanger their plans to transform the kingdom into a business and tourism hub. Into this tinderbox, the U.S. war with Iran flung a spark. Over the past few weeks, the Houthis and Saudi Arabia have spiraled into new clashes that risk expanding into another full-blown war. The Houthis have one solution for every problem in the world, which is to go to war, said Faria al-Maslimi, a Yemen-focused fellow at the London-based research group Chatham House. The Saudis solve every problem by trying to shower it with money, he added, and the Houthis by shooting at it. The last Saudi-Houthi war pushed Yemen to the brink of famine until it paused with a fragile truce in 2022. By then, the Houthis had created a de facto state in northern Yemen, and the south was nominally controlled by Yemen's internationally recognized government, which is financially and militarily dependent on Saudi Arabia. Talks towards a durable peace deal eventually stalled. The limbo was never going to last, but Saudi Arabia, distracted by other crises, appeared to hope it would hold a bit longer. The Saudi ambassador to Yemen, Mohammed al-Jaber, said in a social media post on Saturday that the kingdom was keen to de-escalate. He blamed the Houthis for insisting on a path of escalation and violence and accused them of serving foreign agendas in an apparent reference to Iran. But the battle-hardened Houthis may think they have much to gain from a new confrontation with Saudi Arabia, including access to Yemeni oil revenue and greater authority over the country, according to officials and diplomats who have dealt with the militia. Our souls are content with any level of sacrifice, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the group's leader, said in a televised speech on July 16th after tensions with Saudi Arabia spiked. Risk of new all-out war grows. The Houthis are acting in support of their main ally, Iran, but also to force Saudi Arabia and the international community to make political concessions to Yemen, according to researchers who study the group. In the past week, the Houthis have fired missiles and drones into Saudi Arabia and to ships in the Red Sea, disrupting already volatile global energy markets, while a Saudi-led military coalition has carried out airstrikes in Houthi-held territory for the first time in years. There is a real concern that the international Yemeni war could reignite, said April Ali, an analyst who worked on Yemen's peace process at the United Nations and is now a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, a research organization. This account of the situation in Yemen is based on interviews with Yemeni officials, current and former Western diplomats involved in Yemen's peace process, and regional analysts. Many spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss the details of sensitive political negotiations. The Houthis have chosen a vulnerable moment for Saudi Arabia, analysts say. Saudi Arabia typically exports most of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway that Iran has effectively blocked since the Iran war began. The kingdom now depends on the Red Sea to export oil, the lifeblood of its economy. The Houthis are good at smelling blood in the water, Ms. Ali said. The Saudi response so far has been calibrated to try to avoid getting sucked into a broader war, said Ahmed Naji, a senior analyst for Yemen at International Crisis Group. But if they hold back entirely, they risk emboldening the Houthis, he added. The Saudis are cornered and they feel like there will be a higher cost if they stay silent, he said. Trapped in the middle of this power struggle are tens of millions of Yemeni citizens suffering from widespread deprivation. Some of them say that even a return to fighting would be better than their current despair. We've had enough of this hardship and we needed a way out, whether through dialogue or war, said Ayman Abdulhaq, a 43-year-old father of four and taxi driver in the Houthi-controlled capital of Yemen, Sana'a. People are always looking for a breakthrough, no matter the consequences, he added. Again, due to the length of this article, I'm going to fast forward and just read the concluding paragraphs. Whether things escalate further could depend on the Trump administration's stance. A senior Trump administration official told the New York Times that the United States would empower its allies to take the lead in regional security and supported a diplomatic resolution in Yemen. On July 23rd, Mr. Trump threatened on social media to inflict major military punishment on the militia if they continue to attack Saudi oil tankers. He expressed disappointment with the Houthis, saying they had until now acted very professionally and smart. Flames advance on Bordeaux, where evacuees balance dread and hope. With surrounding towns in southwestern France evacuated and fire still spreading rapidly, several thousand are sheltering in the city, unsure what will become of their homes. This is an article by Mark Landler and Julia Imbert. As a fierce, fast-moving, and capricious wildfire spread to within 10 miles of Bordeaux on Sunday, the city, France's sixth largest, had become a refuge for thousands of people evacuated from their towns and villages. Many of them took shelter in Bordeaux's cavernous exhibition center, united by fear, confusion, and a determination to get back to their homes, which they desperately hoped would be spared by the flames. There are differing voices in this instant community attesting the divergent lives of the people across the Gironde region. Fear is leavened by hope. Gratitude to the firefighters is tinged by anger toward the authorities, and optimism in a swift recovery is offset by uneasiness about the natural forces that led to the disaster. I don't want to start again at zero to find a new apartment, said Amin El-Adrizi, 35, a single mother who fled at 4 a.m. on Saturday after the police pounded on her door to warn her it was time to leave. I don't have the means. Ms. El-Adrizi, who was born in Morocco, said she had carefully gathered all her immigration and residency documents, filling her suitcase with papers in place of clothing. Her two daughters were born in France, she said, but she couldn't shake the fear that if she left the country, she might not be allowed back in. Her friend, Atika Farhati, 77, a retired hospital worker, said she worried about losing her apartment and treasured possessions, including a Chinese vase. Her town, Icines, the northwest of Bordeaux, lies in the path of the fires, which were blown east by swirling winds from the Atlantic toward the city. The sky was red, she said, recalling the flame-scarred view from her fifth-floor balcony. Now that we're here, we can only wonder how it's going to end. For Roger Puron, that outcome is not seriously in doubt. A retired engineer who worked at an armaments factory in Saint-Médard-en-Jalles, Mr. Puron, 89, said he was confident the fire would be stopped short of his town, if only to prevent it from igniting a factory that makes fuel for strategic ballistic missiles. If that ever happened to the industry, he said, it would be a true catastrophe. Still, Mr. Puron said France has never witnessed a fire like this, and it raised profound questions about how people should change their relationship to their environment. Sprawling pine forests that were planted across the region over centuries are now an accelerant for fire. We need to replace the trees because the sap in the pines is flammable and the trees don't have deep roots, so they are easily blown over by the wind, Mr. Puron said. Pines were planted to drain the region's swamps, but they are no longer suited to the environment. We need sequoias, he added. They're sturdy. French officials backed up Mr. Puron's contention about the extraordinary nature of the fire, reflecting a warmer climate. about 42,000 hectares. It's 103 acres. Excuse me, 103,000 acres have burned in Gironde since the fire started last week. It has forced the evacuation of about 220,000 people, one of the largest peacetime evacuations in French history. At the same time, in central Spain, fires in central Spain have burned about 50,000 hectares and displaced 105,000 people. Again, due to its length, I'll fast forward to the end of the article. At the exhibition center, the talk was of how long people would have to wait before they would be allowed back home. People passed the time reading, playing cards, and in the case of one young man, Julien Hocard, picking at his guitar. There's a solidarity that we've seen emerge here, one that's slowly growing, Mr. Hocard said, sitting on a camp bed next to his friend Céline Lartigue. She said she had been impressed by the firefighters' efforts to stem the blaze, but from a nearby bed, Rabat Boukhabas piped up to disagree. I think the authorities have reacted late, he said. They should have recognized the gravity of the situation. They could have prevented it, said Mr. Bakubas, 70, but they could not have prevented it, but they could have limited it. The story behind the New York Police Academy's new name. The officer honored on the facade of the training center in Queens moved New York City in 1980s with this message of forgiveness. This article is by Maria Kramer. Officer Stephen McDonald could not move or speak. He had been lying in a bed at Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan for nearly 9 months, recovering from gunshots that had severed his spinal cord and left him paralyzed from the neck down. Shavud Jones, the 15-year-old boy who had shot him on July 12, 1986, was behind bars. Officer McDonald's 1-month-old son, Connor, was about to be baptized in the hospital chapel in front of reporters and news photographers. Officer McDonald was eager to send a message to the teenager who shot him, but all he could do was mouth his words, which his wife, Patty Ann McDonald, wrote down. I'm sometimes angry at the teenage boy who shot me, but more often I feel sorry for him, Ms. McDonald said, reading his words to reporters as his respirator wheezed in the background. I forgive him. That message, delivered in March 1987, moved New York in an era when violent crime was rampant and racial tension and anti-police sentiment were prevalent. For the next 30 years, Officer McDonald traveled throughout the city and around the world, telling police officers, school children, and politicians his story and asking them to believe in the power of compassion. He died in 2017 of complications from his injuries. He was 59. Earlier this month, the New York Police Department named its academy in Queens after him. Replicas of his shields and his uniform, along with his wheelchair and respirator, are now encased behind glass in the lobby. Detective Stephen D. McDonald, he was promoted in 1995, is affixed in white letters in the front of the steel gray building. Commissioner Jessica S. Tisch said she came up with the idea in January while sitting in St. Patrick's Cathedral, where during a memorial for him, God spoke to me. This department needed to find a permanent way to honor Stephen McDonald and ensure that his example would remain part of the NYPD for generations to come, she said during a ceremony at the Academy where Ms. McDonald and Connor McDonald, now a captain in the police department, sat close by. Ms. McDonald was 3 months pregnant with Connor when her husband, then 29, went into the northeast section of Central Park on a July afternoon to investigate reports of bicycle thefts. He approached Shavud, who was walking with 2 friends near the Harlem Mere, an artificial lake in Central Park where muggings and thefts were commonplace at the time. As Officer McDonald began patting down one of the boys, Shavud pulled out a gun and fired 3 shots. Officer McDonald's injuries were so severe that doctors said he would not survive the night. Then they told him he should not expect to live more than 5 years. Soon they stopped making predictions, Captain McDonald, 39, said in an interview. Ms. McDonald said some people questioned her husband's decision to forgive Shavud, but she believes it might have saved his life. If he hadn't, it would have destroyed him from the inside out, Ms. McDonald said. But forgiveness took the relationship only so far. When he was up for parole, Mr. Jane's family asked Officer McDonald if he would be willing to ask for his early release. Officer McDonald told them he could not. His father, Captain McDonald, felt Shavud had to do his time. His father hoped that when Mr. Jones got out, the two would team up and preach a message of peace. I don't think we've ever seen anything like what I envisioned, the two of us together, he told the Los Angeles Times in March 1995 interview. Maybe Shabbat and I will go to schools together and speak to kids. It'd be an amazing sight. He never got that chance. Shortly after the interview, Mr. Jones was released. 3 days later, he was killed in a motorcycle accident in East Harlem. Connor McDonald, then 8, stood up in front of his third-grade class and asked the other students to pray for Mr. Jones. My dad would always tell me that compared to Shabbat, my life was very good and that we had to feel sorry for him, Captain McDonald said. I felt compelled as a young kid to forgive him and asked my classmates to forgive him. After Captain McDonald graduated from Boston College, he volunteered with homeless teenagers in Denver before joining the police academy. His father beamed with pride. I, on the other hand, was like, "Are you kidding?" Ms. McDonald said. My plan was for him to work at a friend's law firm, then go to law school. But the job felt like a calling and a legacy. His great aunt, uncle, grandfather had also been New York police officers. His great grandfather, James Conway, was an officer in the Bronx when he was shot in 1936 in the chest, trying to stop two men who had just held up a tavern. Officer Conway survived. Stephen McDonald prayed constantly that he might walk again. He went to Catholic Mass daily and visited Lourdes, France, and Medjugorje, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that, in Bosnia, pilgrimage sites where children claimed the Virgin Mary had appeared to them. At both places, he asked for a miracle. But he did not become embittered, his son said. He never once regretted becoming a police officer. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And again, most of these articles are very long. So to hear them in their complete format, the number 716-821-5555. In Washington, Netanyahu faces delicate balancing act. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel is set to meet President Trump on Tuesday with an eye on Iran and another on the coming elections back home. This article by Isabel Kirshner. For Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, a meeting with President Trump is always an opportunity to showcase their close relationship, even if they, at times, disagree. This time, the stakes are especially high. Both leaders are facing electoral challenges in the months ahead and are expected to meet at the White House on Tuesday as their interests appear to be diverging sharply on the war with Iran. Before departing for Washington on Monday, Mr. Netanyahu said in a statement that this would be his 8th meeting with Mr. Trump since the president was elected for his second term, and that Iran would be first and foremost on the agenda. I am embarking on this mission with one clear goal: to ensure the security, strength, and future of our dear state of Israel, he added. Mr. Netanyahu, who is trailing in the opinion polls at home before Israel's fall vote, is under pressure to show his domestic audience that he still has a close working relationship with Mr. Trump. Analysts say, despite their differences, Mr. Trump is heading into U.S. midterm elections in November after an unpopular war that many believed he was dragged into by Israel and that has caused tensions between Israel and Washington. Both leaders failed to deliver on their war goals of ending Iran's nuclear program and overthrowing the country's authoritarian clerical rulers in their joint war against Iran, which began in late February. We see that Trump is interested in reaching an agreement, said Danny Citrinowicz, a former Israeli military intelligence commander and an Iran specialist at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. Israel doesn't want to hear about an agreement, so there's no alignment of interests, he said. Israeli leaders view returning to the war as preferable, he said, because any U.S. peace agreement with Iran will strengthen the regime in Tehran that they want to see toppled. While Israel is focused on potentially existential threats from Iran's nuclear ambitions, Mr. Trump's focus is on freeing movement through the Strait of Hormuz, a critical shipping route for oil. The United States has been going it alone in the latest fighting against Iran, and before that largely left Israel a partner of the war a partner in the war, out of peace talks. If Mr. Trump does expand his attacks on Iran, analysts say he may still want to keep Israel on the sidelines. The irony, Mr. Citrinowitz said, is that Mr. Netanyahu told Mr. Trump that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's former supreme leader, had to be killed to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. Now there is a new Ayatollah Khamenei, and Israel is saying Iran has to be stopped from obtaining nuclear weapons again. Mr. Netanyahu, whose visit was timed so he could also attend services for Senator Lindsey Graham, has championed his close relationship with Mr. Trump in Israeli election campaigns, but the relationship has swung erratically over the past few months, and recently they appear to be at a low. Mr. Trump has veered from praising Mr. Netanyahu as a great wartime leader to belittling him, saying, "He'll do whatever I want him to do." Mr. Trump confirmed that he had called Mr. Netanyahu crazy in a phone call and has called him a very difficult guy. Mr. Netanyahu has maintained a diplomatic silence, but Mr. Trump's preliminary deal to end the war with Iran last month caused widespread consternation in Israel because of its apparent shortcomings in addressing the country's security needs. Mr. Netanyahu's loyalists responded by vilifying the American president and his top aides. Then Mr. Trump signed an agreement last week with Saudi Arabia to develop a civilian nuclear program, which Israelis fear could lead to a regional arms race. Mr. Trump subsequently declared that the deal would be contingent on Saudi Arabia's establishing diplomatic ties with Israel, but Israelis remained unconvinced. What goes on behind the scenes between the two leaders, however, has proved to be inscrutable and surprising at times. Mr. Netanyahu has managed to influence Mr. Trump in the past, analysts say, and it can be impossible to know if the pair are at loggerheads or in cahoots. Itamar Rabinovich, a former Israeli ambassador to the United States and a professor emeritus of Middle Eastern history at Tel Aviv University, said that if the United States resumes a war against Iran, clearly Trump is not interested in seeming to be doing it in collaboration with Netanyahu because that will look like a repetition of the unsuccessful venture of a few months ago. But Israel may end up participating, he said, because if Iran launches missiles against Israel, Israel will respond. There are other issues in the Middle East on which Israel and the Trump administration do not necessarily agree and which are important for Mr. Netanyahu before the Israeli election. The administration limited Israeli military actions against the Hezbollah militia in Lebanon and is pushing Israel to begin to withdraw troops from southern Lebanon and Syria. The ceasefire in Gaza has floundered and tensions and violence are on the rise in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Cut off from fuel, Cuba is still surviving. President Trump has tried to strangle Cuba by blocking its oil imports, but 6 months later, the island is finding ways to endure. This article is by Jack Nikas. By Jack Nikas, excuse me. For months, President Trump has been predicting that Cuba is about to collapse. It's just going to fall, he told reporters on January 4th, a day after taking control of Venezuela's oil, which had been Cuba's lifeline. He then imposed an oil blockade that has pushed the island into its worst ever energy crisis, with mass blackouts now lasting nearly all day. And yet, more than 6 months later, the Cuban government and people are still standing. This month, we visited the country to understand how. After a week on the ground, we found that while Cubans are clearly suffering, they are also doing what perhaps they do best, adapting. They're swapping their gas-guzzling 1950s American cars for electric motorcycles and rickshaws from China, importing hefty lithium batteries to help keep televisions and fans running through blackouts, jury-rigging generators to run on more accessible natural gas, and installing solar panels on rooftops and even vehicles. Together, the workarounds amount to a new Cuban energy grid, this one more in the hands of the Cuban people, propping up society with the electricity off and the fuel lines dry. These solutions have enabled the Cuban government to ration power by turning on the lights for just a few hours a day, stretching out whatever scarce fuel it has left in an effort to withstand Washington's intense pressure campaign. The result is that Cuba has lasted far longer without fuel shipments than the Trump administration appears to have expected. Over nearly 7 decades of U.S. pressure, Cuba has defied the odds and improvised to survive. Now it seems that Mr. Trump, like many U.S. presidents before him, is also finding that toppling the government founded by Fidel Castro is not so simple. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told reporters last week that the Trump administration still wants to see the Cuban government fall. We're prepared to be very realistic about how you do that and patient, he said. These are complex things that take time, and obviously we're prepared to do what we can. The Cuban government is seeking a deal. Cuba is not an enemy of the United States, Carlos Fernandez de Casio, Cuba's deputy foreign minister, said in an interview. What we would like is a constructive and respectful relationship. Meantime, the Cuban people, as they have for decades, are making do. Cubans thrive amid crisis, said Humberto Palmera, a 55-year-old farmer standing on the hill where he grew up along Cuba's coastline with a view toward Florida. His siblings had already left for Miami and his 2 children are fleeing to Spain, but he said he is determined to stay. After hearing about the oil blockade, Mr. Palermo learned on YouTube how to distill junk plastic into homemade gasoline and diesel. He has since built a tiny makeshift refinery in his backyard to power his motorcycle and light his stove. We look for solutions, he said. The economic restrictions are slowly killing us, but we're pulling through with all our might, manage to get by until we see what happens next. Misery and grit. In Havana and beyond, the crisis's effects were clear. We met families walking 2 hours for water because government pumps had run out of diesel. Women, lacking gas, cooked with firewood on the street. Powerless refrigerators became cabinets. Hitchhikers littered roadsides after the city halted public busing, and dozens of people told us they were simply exhausted after so many sleepless nights in the sweltering heat without fans or air conditioning. But we also saw a country that was still functioning. Vehicles were on the road despite black market gasoline reaching $30 a gallon because many were electric. Restaurants were open for the few who could afford them, powered by rumbling generators out back. Hospitals, government buildings, and the airport had power because they were on protected parts of the grid. Medical clinics, nursing homes, and bank branches ran off solar panels donated by China. Cell service was sometimes working. Televisions showing the World Cup were not hard to find, and even roadside stands were serving cold beer from refrigerators powered by the sun. But the makeshift energy grid also exposed Cuba's inequality. The batteries, solar panels, and electric vehicles overwhelmingly belong to wealthier Cubans, which usually means those with relatives abroad. Their poor neighbors often live without power and scrape by with meager pay amid rising inflation. The situation here is fine because the owner can afford to buy solar panels, said Yina Oliva, 26, a bartender at a roadside restaurant. But for us at home, life is awful. On wages of roughly $1 a day, she said she struggles to buy milk for her 3-year-old daughter, and then their food spoils quickly without electricity. Other Cubans are electrifying their homes with the gas piped in for cooking and heating water. About 280,000 residences in Havana have such gas lines, and many are connecting them to modified generators designed to run on liquid fuel. Cuba produces the gas domestically, so it is one of the few energy sources not affected by the blockade. The gas is also cheap, especially for the 120,000 households that pay a flat rate regardless of use. One man said he had been running a generator off gas almost nonstop and yet was still billed the same 50 pesos or 8 cents for the month. One of our final nights in Havana, we found a bar still full of patrons past midnight, powering its string lights and Latin music with a natural gas generator. Outside, we met Kiki Rodriguez, 37, founder of a Cuban barbecue business, Mantica, that has expanded during the crisis. He now employs 18 people to cook and deliver pork and plantains to customers across Havana. We're the masters of this, he said. We've been figuring things out our whole lives. He pointed to the rooftop where he said he was finishing a remodel to open his first brick and mortar restaurant powered by the same generator. How are things going to play out? Nobody knows, he added, but when people say the country is going to fall apart, I don't exactly know what they mean. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump asks Supreme Court to allow order restricting mail voting. The Trump administration asks justices to intervene after an appeals court blocked key parts of a mail-in voting executive order. This article is by Abby Van Sickle. The Trump administration on Monday asked the Supreme Court to clear the way for an executive order by President Trump that restricts voting by mail, setting up a legal showdown as the president pushes for more control over voting ahead of the midterm elections in November. The administration filed the emergency application to the justices after a federal appeals court on Saturday blocked key parts of his executive order. In the application, Solicitor General John D. Sauer called the lower court ruling indefensible, asserting that it imposed serious irreparable harm on the federal government and would bar federal agencies from implementing an executive order promoting election integrity in the upcoming federal elections in November. The legal battle stems from an executive order signed by Mr. Trump in late March that had attempted to place limits on mail-in voting, including using federal oversight of the U.S. Postal Service to gain greater control over mail-in voting practices. The executive order directed the Department of Homeland Security to create state-by-state citizen lists that would help determine voter eligibility. It then called on the Postal Service to use lists provided by states to determine if voters should be allowed to vote by mail. More than 20 Democratic attorneys general challenged the order in court, arguing that it violated several provisions of the Constitution, including the separation of powers by having the executive branch take control of functions usually regulated by Congress and the states. The Supreme Court on Monday asked the challengers to respond to the government's emergency application by Monday, August 3rd. Mr. Trump has repeatedly criticized mail-in voting and sought restrictions on it. For years, he has made unfounded claims, sowing doubt about voting by mail and claiming that it allows widespread fraud. So far, federal courts have stymied many of Mr. Trump's efforts to restrict mail voting. In late June, a federal judge issued a ruling that blocked key parts of the executive order. Judge Indira Talwani, a federal district judge in Massachusetts, concluded that the Constitution does not grant the president any specific powers over elections. She underlined the words "does not." This weekend, a three-judge panel from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit upheld her decision. The judges wrote that if a president's order were allowed to go into effect for the midterms in November, it would sow confusion and threaten disenfranchisement of many eligible voters. The Constitution gives the states and Congress powers over the elections, and it does not give those powers to the president, the judges wrote. The Supreme Court has shown skepticism of Mr. Trump's efforts to restrict mail-in voting. In late June, the justices upheld a Mississippi law that allows mail-in ballots postmarked by Election Day to be counted if they are received up to 5 business days later, a rejection of the Trump administration's efforts to overturn the statute. In that ruling, Justice John G. Roberts Jr. and Justice Amy Coney Barrett joined the court's 3 liberals, announcing that nothing in federal law requires ballots to be received by Election Day, provided they are cast by that day. Although the ruling focused on Mississippi's law, it also appeared to leave in place similar laws in at least 18 other states and territories, including Nevada and California, that harbor battleground congressional districts in the midterm elections. After the decision was announced, Mr. Trump posted on social media calling the ruling a tremendous loss and urging Congress to pass legislation that places restrictions on mail-in ballots and adds new voter identification requirements. Even in Utah, land of big love, families are getting smaller. Forget trad wives. When it comes to plummeting fertility rates, Utah is leading the country. This is an article by Sabrina Tavernese and Jeff Adelson. Utah has long been famous for its large families. From the Osmond Singers to the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, the picture has been one of young people marrying and having a lot of babies. But Utah is now experiencing the biggest fertility drop in its modern history. After a peak in 2007, Utah's rate has plummeted by more than 37%, the largest decline of any state in the country. Utah, which was number one in the nation for fertility rates for years, is now ranked sixth. Utah is a leading example of a demographic transformation that is sweeping the United States and other rich countries as young women increasingly delay childbearing. As the trend deepens, the worry is that more women would forego having children altogether, a choice that could have serious consequences for the country economically and politically. For the first time, about half of all 30-year-old women are childless. Adriana Guzman Sierra of Salt Lake City is one. Her childhood, she said, was chaotic and stressful, with parents who she says were not ready to raise kids. Mr. Guzman Sierra, who is 33 and has worked as a teacher and in child welfare, said she was happy to have grown up in an era where childbearing is a choice. I've always loved kids, she said. I just never wanted to have them. Whether this is a profound transformation in American life or a temporary dip is still an open question. The drop in fertility rate captures women having fewer or no children, but also women simply waiting to have them. However, the duration of the drop has led some demographers to predict that something deep is going on. The factors are many. One reason Utah's decline is so sharp is that it had so far to fall. The state's annual fertility rate, the number of children born in a year divided by the number of women aged 15 to 44, is still higher than the national rate. That's in part the influence of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which encourages large families. Its members, polls suggest, make up about half of Utah's population. An influx of new residents drawn to the booming economy have also made Utah less like the white church enclave it once was and more like the rest of the country. But the decline also reflects the power of broad social dynamics pushing down fertility rates. Despite hand-wringing among conservatives, women in one of the country's most socially conservative states are now making very different choices about their childbearing. Many women interviewed for this article said they were waiting until they had finished their educations and were financially stable. They say 2 incomes are required to afford a middle-class life in Utah's exploding housing market, which is the 10th most expensive in the nation, according to the University of Utah. More than 39% of babies in Utah were born to mothers with a college degree in 2024, compared with about 27.5% in 2009, the Times found. It's really amazing to me how much things have changed, said Holly Garcia, the director of Child Care and Family Services at Salt Lake Community College. Having a kid at 35, it used to be almost unheard of. Now it's more and more of the moms coming. Her sister Heidi Spence is an example. She had her first child at 38. Despite growing up as one of 8 children in a church family, she wasn't drawn to being a mother. I wasn't a little girl who liked playing mommy, she said. After graduating from high school, she went to work at a fabric store as a cashier at Lowe's as a waitress. Eventually, she enrolled in community college, then obtained her bachelor's and master's degrees. Along the way, she met her husband, who was completing a doctoral degree in pharmacy. They lived in a tiny apartment, studying full-time and working long hours. Having children seemed too overwhelming, she said. Now 44, Mrs. Spence is a financial director for a nonprofit in Salt Lake City. She and her husband have 3 young children. They own a house with a large yard and 3 cars. After a second child, she began to yearn for more children and thought, maybe I should have started this earlier. But there were advantages to having children later. I'm really glad that my kids did not have to deal with me in an earlier, less mature, and less stable time, she said. The downside is I'm going to spend less time with them in their lifetimes. Change within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is another driver of Utah's plunging birth rate. A 2025 comprehensive study by researchers at Brigham Young University found that while a majority of older women stayed in the church, less than 40% of 18-year-old women did. Men, on the other hand, stayed in the church at high rates with little generational differences, said Justin Dyer, the lead researcher. That can affect decisions around childbearing. Savannah Sanborn grew up in the church. As a child, she threw herself into its teachings. At 10, she wrote and stored a letter to her future husband. I had this intense need for perfectionism, she said. I really thrived within the structure of the church. But she began questioning the culture at 19. She admired a young pastor who ended up running afoul of the church because he came out as gay. She married at 20, but quickly realized she did not want the life that came next, having children and running the household. The pressure of completing the perfect Mormon picture started to crack me open, she said. Now 29, she is divorced and studying for a bachelor's degree in math while working. She doesn't feel any particularly career driven. After experiences in the church, she is very wary of external forces determining the direction of her. As for children, she thinks she might want them, but not now. It would halt a lot of my hobbies, the time I can spend just wandering libraries all day, which is my love, she said. I'm not ready to give up that life yet. The church itself has expressed concern over falling fertility rates. Last year, in a major sermon, Dallin Oaks, the president of the church, urged members not to lose sight of the value of children. Utah is still the state with the largest family size in the country, but that may be changing too. The women interviewed for this article came from families of as many as 8 children, but they themselves tended to have few. Democrats reset the Maine Senate race. Now comes the tricky part. Troy Jackson is replacing Graham Plattner, but Republicans are seeking to tie them together as a remade race kicks off with high stakes. This is an article by Reed J. Epstein and Jess Bidgood. Democrats in Maine have reset a Senate race seen as critical to their party's chances of retaking the chamber after an improvised scramble to swap out a damaged candidate, Graham Plattner, for a new one, Troy Jackson, after a wild 17 days. Now comes the tricky part. Mr. Jackson, a former state Senate president, is trying to keep alive the grassroots energy that Mr. Plattner built over the past year while distancing himself from the former nominee's personal history. With help from her allies, Senator Susan Collins, the 5-term Republican he is trying to defeat, is seeking to tie the two Democrats together in ways the GOP hopes will alienate swing voters. A 100-day contest. This dynamic is beginning to shape a 100-day contest that will drench this largely rural state with money, place it at the epicenter of the national fight for Senate control. Democrats have turned to a familiar fixture of state government and a fifth-generation logger from Maine's Northwoods to make their case against a far better funded incumbent who has already defied national headwinds once in the Trump era. The race will test whether Mr. Jackson can leave behind the baggage of a candidate in Mr. Plattner, who bowed out after a rape allegation that he denies, revelations about a tattoo that resembled a Nazi symbol, and a trail of offensive online posts. By replacing Mr. Plattner with Mr. Jackson, Maine Democrats hope to make the race less about their candidate and more about painting Ms. Collins as a tool of the ultra wealthy and a rubber stamp for President Trump on the most pressing matters. Who has she served, Mr. Jackson? Asked Maine Democrats at the Saturday convention where he was officially selected to be his party's nominee. She served Donald Trump. Ms. Collins, in a brief interview before a Saturday parade in Casco, Maine, signaled an intent to portray her new rival as an outsider, as outside the mainstream and in many ways a continuation of the Plattner campaign. My likely new opponent has adopted exactly the same platform as my old opponent, she said. It's the Democratic Socialist platform and it's very similar, so the issues have not changed. It's no secret that what Mr. Jackson plans to do, tie Ms. Collins to Mr. Trump, who lost the statewide vote in Maine in each of his 3 presidential campaigns. At the Saturday convention where Democrats picked Mr. Jackson as their new candidate, speaker after speaker cited Ms. Collins' vote for Brett Kavanaugh, the Trump-nominated Supreme Court justice who Ms. Collins voted to confirm after claiming she received an assurance that he would protect abortion rights. She voted with him 96% of the time, Mr. Jackson said of Ms. Collins during his victory remarks Saturday. She helped deliver an enormous tax breaks to corporations and the wealthy on our backs. She voted to confirm Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, the Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade. Making that case will require Mr. Jackson, whose Senate campaign started with 0 money 2 weeks ago, to raise a lot and quickly. Ms. Collins had 11 million at the end of June, according to her latest campaign finance report. The Senate Republicans' main super PAC, which has announced it will spend 42 million in Maine alone, began attacking Mr. Jackson minutes after he was named the nominee. Again, I'm fast forwarding to the end of the article. Both sides brace for a tight race. Ms. Collins won in 2020 with 51% of the vote against a field splintered by two independent candidates. This time she will face only Mr. Jackson in a political environment polls show could be worse for Republicans than it was 6 years ago. Limited public polling in Maine has shown a close Senate contest, and both candidates have headwinds of history pushing against them. Ms. Collins will once again have to detach her political fortunes from an unpopular president. Mr. Jackson is trying to become the first Democrat to win a Maine Senate race since George Mitchell won re-election in 1988. Senator Angus King of Maine caucuses with Democrats, but he was elected as an independent. Lance Dutson, a Maine Republican and former campaign aide to Ms. Collins, said she was perfectly comfortable running against a standard issue Democrat as opposed to a political phenomenon as Mr. Plattner became before he dropped out. It's easier to say, this is your resume, what have you done for Maine? And this is my resume, what have I done for Maine? Mr. Dutson said. That puts Collins on much more solid footing. For his part, Mr. Jackson did not directly answer when he was asked after the convention if he could point to any issue on which he differs from Mr. Plattner. I don't know about the daylight, the separation, any of that stuff, he said. All I know is I'm Troy Jackson and I care about Maine. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. A once outlawed Maori art form is alive and in the flesh. Young Maori in New Zealand are embracing te moko, the ritual tattoos that were banned under British colonial rule and became an act of protest in the 1970s. This is an article by Francesca Regalado and Tatiana Chipsanova. Mark Kupoa pressed his face close as he drew on his nephew's arm with a felt-tip marker. From memory, he sketched patterns and motifs that had been in their family for generations. Finally satisfied, he pulled on rubber gloves and a needle gun buzzed to life. This was no regular tattoo. This was tamoko, the ritual body art practiced for centuries by the Maori, the indigenous inhabitants of New Zealand. Half a dozen of Mr. Kupoa's relatives observed the ritual in February, squeezing into the small studio in Gisborne on the east coast of New Zealand's North Island. Mr. Kupoa and his nephew, Desmond Hormia, 56, Mr. Kupoa is 64 and Desmond is 56, grew up in a Maori community that had lost all its Tahunga Tamoko, or ritual tattoo artists. The craft had been traditionally handed down from parent to child, but in 1907, New Zealand's British colonial rulers banned takmoko and other indigenous art forms. Maori people began hiding their tattoos and stopped teaching younger generations. More than a century later, the facial tattoos known as moko kanohi are being seen again on television, on the streets, and in the halls of New Zealand's parliament. Maori teens and young adults have taken to documenting their tamoko ceremonies on social media. Some have convinced their elders to be tattooed, helping the art form make a jubilant comeback after decades of stigma. I've been involved with this for well over 30 years now, but our culture is still relearning because they've been immersed and overwhelmed by Western culture, Mr. Kupoa said. Mr. Kupoa and a small group of other artisans began tattooing faces after Maori nationalist movement gained ground in the 1970s. Moku was asleep at the time. We decided we want to wake this thing back up again, he said. A moku kanui is the work of a lifetime. A person's history can be gleaned from the tattoos on their face, signifying their ancestry and marking their coming of age, the birth of a child, or the death of a relative. Women are marked on their lips and chin with moku kanai. Men receive mata ora, which starts on the chin and grows outward to mark personal milestones. Family trees can be traced through recurring patterns on different faces. It's a triumphant thing. It's a thumbprint of your genealogy, said Rahuana Smith, 32, a woodcarver who is an advisor on Maori relations to the Marlborough District Council on the South Island of the town of Blenheim. He received a Meteora in 2023 to honor his great grandmother after her death. It took 4.5 hours to tattoo Mr. Smith's chin, nose, and cheeks as family members watched. In some Taimoko ceremonies, relatives sing blessings and hold the person's hands and arms as they undergo the ritual. While today's Taimoko artists use modern tattoo machines, traditionally the Tahuanga would use blades carved from shark teeth or the wing bones of an albatross, Mr. Kapua said. Without forebears to teach them, Mr. Kapua, a Tohongo Wakero or master woodcarver, learned Taimoko from the patterns he used in carving and weaving. They studied Moko Kanohi patterns on decapitated heads that were under the care of New Zealand's National Museum. Maori warriors believed that decapitation severed their enemies' connection to the gods. In the 19th century, British settlers collected the heads as curiosities and trophies and offered guns and gold in exchange, prompting some Maori people to hunt down those who wore Matuara and Mokokai. That was one thing that stopped our ancestors from wanting to get their faces tattooed, Mr. Kapua said. Maori who converted to Christianity at the time were also discouraged from getting tattoos. The ultimate blow, however, came with the Tohunga Suppression Act in 1907, which outlawed Maori experts, including priests, healers, and teachers, woodcarvers, and tattoo artists. The legislation aimed at prohibiting practices that the authorities deemed exploitative, suffocated Maori culture for decades. New Zealand's parliament repealed the law in 1962, but for years afterwards, Moko Kanohi was seen as a sign of a criminal or a gang member, Mr. Smith said. None of the art forms are illegal anymore, but we have to undo the damage. Tame Iti, one of the leaders of the 1970s Maori movement, has moko that spiral across his face from his forehead past his neck and over his ears. The 74-year-old recalls growing up at a time when hotels and other public venues barred anyone with facial markings. He ran for parliament 4 times, none of them successful, but became a national figure. It's E.T.'s last attempt to enter parliament was in 2014. 2 years later, Nani Ayi Mahuta, sorry, I'm doing my best with these names, became the first woman to wear a moku kanai in the House of Representatives, the sole chamber of the New Zealand's parliament. She served as foreign minister under Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Now you've got politicians, judges, all kinds of people with moko. It's beautiful that it's out there, she said. Don't go to the Kennedy Center. A tour guide wants you to see it anyway. In a dogged demonstration of love for a Washington institution, Sandy Weiswasser is among a few dozen volunteers still showing dwindling visitors a hollowed-out building. This article by Elizabeth Williamson. Some days no one turns up for a tour at all. Most days there are only a few, including those curious about all the reports of ruin. When people do come, what do they see? In the opera house, which no longer has an opera, there is an empty orchestra pit scattered with trash. On the grand terrace overlooking the Potomac River, the flower beds are wilting and weeding. In the corridors and lounges, artwork has disappeared. And yet, Sandy Weiswasser, a retired 6th grade teacher who for the 18 years has given hundreds of people free tours of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, keeps reporting for duty. In a dogged demonstration of love and loyalty for an institution that has elevated life for her and millions of visitors, she still arrives every Monday for her tour day, knowing she may soon find the doors locked. This place used to be really thriving and busy and crowded, Ms. Weiswasser, 87, said. Now it's a black hole. No one knows yet whether President Trump, who in his second term gutted the center's leadership, purged its programming, and whose handpicked board had his name drilled into the building front, will close Kennedy Center in the coming weeks as part of what he says is a 2-year renovation plan. The center's board is expected to make a final determination in August, but at this point it scarcely matters, Ms. Weisweiser says. Last month, the National Symphony Orchestra played its final Kennedy concert for the season, unsure of when or if it will return. Marquee bookings and artists have fled. Everywhere is the heavy, closed curtain silence of an institution that has lost some 90% of its employees and 100% of its paying audience. Ms. Weiswasser keeps coming to give tours, she said, to bear witness, to tell her dwindling visitors that the shabby emptiness they see is not what the Kennedy Center was. For more than half a century, it was a grand democratic project, she tells them, bringing the beauty and inspiration of the arts to everyone. Ms. Weiswasser offers herself as proof its mission did not fail. She is the daughter of Polish immigrants whose grandmother was lost in World War II and presumed by the family to have died in a Nazi concentration camp. She grew up in Detroit, taking piano lessons and listening to classical music on AM radio with her mother, and she had seen more live performances at the Kennedy Center than anywhere else. So on tour days, she said, I don't count success by the number of people who hear me. Every person is valuable. She invoked a Talmudic proverb that whoever saves one life saves the entire world. Besides, she said, laughing only a little, I don't do anything half-assed. Once she was among 140 volunteer guides who gave tours in 10 languages to up to 400,000 people a year. Last week on her Monday shift, only 5 out of more than a dozen tour guides showed up, and only 3 people took a tour. A spokesman for the center declined to say how many guides still volunteer. Ms. Weiswasser said her plan is to turn up until she is told otherwise. She is haunted by memories. Her grandson's visit to a musical petting zoo that let children try out all the instruments in a symphony, ushering 5th graders through the opera house wings, telling a group of shy Chinese 12-year-olds that it's never too late to learn an instrument, watching her granddaughters dance in a Washington Ballet performance, taking them to see An American in Paris and The Lion King. I cried inside. I was so happy to have brought them, she said. On a recent Monday, Ms. Weiswasser was at the tour guide information desk on the center's lower level, waiting with 3 other tour guides, all women with something to do. Ms. Weiswasser jumped at the chance to show off the center, even in its current state. I, her lone visitor that day, followed her into the hollowed-out building. Ms. Weiswasser said she tries not to say anything partisan about the Kennedy Center's plight. For her, the institution remains bigger than that, a symbol of the government's power to deliver opportunity and inspiration. I remember being a young girl and thinking, I'm so lucky I was born in America, she said on a recent day. I still feel that way, but I don't have quite the pride that I used to have. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 28th issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Patrice. Thank you for listening. It's been my pleasure to read, and I hope you have a wonderful day.